incredibly accomplished and incredibly humble and wonderful people and good friends. And I really want to thank you for participating on this.
My first Twitter follower, Sam.
Oh, I know. I remember that.
Yeah. You said, "Hey, I know your husband. I'm going to follow you," and you're my first follower.
Oh yeah, you're
now I have
awesome.
3 or 4.
and Willie and Charlie Ebersol are on this call, and they've been told not to be wise guys. And although Charlie was already cycling through the virtual faces, could you just tell me what you're doing right now, your situation right now, and then I want to back up and go back to when you met, and even before that, to when you dropped out of Yale, Dick, and your career. But where are you right now? Let's start with that.
Deliriously retired, now in our 4th month on Maui, about 200 yards back from the water, staying in a friend's place, a wonderful friend because we're not paying. And I'm here with my best friend. And even being together this much of the time for 4 months, we have managed to delight in each other and be deliriously happy.
True.
And we'll be continuing the fight as soon as this is over.
Right.
You know, when you asked us to do this, I said to Dick, you better say to Sam, you sure you want me on there? Because once people ask me, did you know Rock Hudson was gay? They're kind of out of questions. You know, that's kind of it. I haven't worked so long. It's been so long since I worked. So, you know,
I do want to.
The group looks almost old enough. I have to swipe because on my thing I can only get 8 at a time. So group looks old enough to, you know, maybe their mother watched Kate and Ellie. I'm not sure.
Well, now I do want to ask you then, and then I'm going to stop and ask you about hosting the Emmys with the 10 Women of Hollywood and the dress that you wore for that. So now that I've got a different question about that.
It's a pungent story.
Tell me that story.
You know what? When I was doing Macmillan Wife, when I wasn't working, I was living, and mind you, this is 71, 69. I was living in an Airstream trailer in Oregon on 250 acres. And then, you know, in overalls. And then I'd come down and do Macmillan Wife, and they'd use my Airstream as my dressing room. It was pretty cool. Somebody probably owns that today. Anyway, they called on our 4-party line up there and asked if I would be one of the 10 women to host the Emmys, all 10 women. And it was, you know, Mary Tyler Moore and Cher and Carol Burnett, Lucille Ball.
Wow.
And I said, oh, yeah. And I went next door to the commune called Rainbow Mist and asked them if they would make my dress. Because in those days, there was no designer going. You went to, like, Saks and got a dress. So they said, sure. So they sold me this dress out of linen with flying, you know, birds, and there was a rainbow on it and mountains, and it was gorgeous. And when I went to the Emmys, I showed up and nobody was standing near me at all. And I thought, well, just because I don't live here year round, I mean,
the other stars were ignoring you.
Yeah. So I said to Mary Tyler Moore, I feel, and I had done a couple of movies with her. I knew her pretty well. And I said, nobody's talking to me. She said, because your dress smells like a bad ashtray. And I realized they had sewed it next to their wood stove in Oregon, and that I'd never thought I should get this dry cleaned, or, you know, maybe I should. I had no idea I was immune to it. And that was my big, you know, hosting the Emmys thing.
That's great.
That was it. I still have the dress, by the way. I'm thinking maybe an auction. I don't know.
It's out in the garage.
Yeah, yeah, it's airing out.
Yeah, has it aired out yet? That's the question.
Yeah, no.
Dick, I want to ask you about Saturday Night Live because I'm really fascinated with that in the early days of Saturday Night Live and just naming the show, bringing on Lorne Michaels, and sort of that first season.
Well, for starters, it was pure serendipity. The man who was running NBC at the time, he was in his first year actually of running NBC, a guy named Herb Schlosser, reached out to me. I'd never met him. Asked me if I'd come out to Long Island and have lunch with him. It was 4th of July weekend. I went out, and he said that Johnny Carson had just told them in the days before that he didn't want repeats on the weekend anymore. He wanted to do no more than 3, maybe once in a while 4 original shows a week. And Schlosser said NBC was really eager to come up with a program that would air at least on Saturday night to take the place of the Carson repeats, which are now going to be seen like on Mondays and Tuesdays. And remember, I had no entertainment background whatsoever. I'd worked for ABC Sports as a gopher coffee, gopher ice cream, gopher cigarettes. I'd met them at the 24-hour car race of Le Mans. I was a high school AFS student in Normandy, happened to go to the race, went looking for them, didn't watch the race at all, and got hired. And so now I have this great job years later to come up with something to replace the Tonight Show repeats on weekends. And the first thought I had was Richard Pryor. And I sat down with Richard and a friend of his and pretty much agreed that we would come up with the show. And we were sort of progressing toward that. We had two great Hollywood producer writers involved. When one day I got a phone call from a lawyer down in Atlanta, Georgia, said, Dick, I don't know what you're smoking, and I know Richard's crazy about you, but there's no way that NBC is going to let him be Richard Pryor on Saturday nights, even if it's at 11:30 at night. I've told him his career is in pictures and he shouldn't do this. And boom, my idea was out the window. 2 weeks later, somebody came for a meeting with me and brought a young producer, Lorne Michaels, and he and I hit it off. We didn't make a deal with the other guy, but Lorne and I spent the next month together sort of sifting through ideas. And I convinced the NBC brass to hire him. And we had basically about 9 months to mount the first show that went on the air in October of '75.
So you were in your mid-20s, late 20s?
At 26, probably, yep.
Wow. So you had two young kids, I mean, running this thing.
Definitely, but he did have a background as a writer. First of all, he'd had a variety show with a friend in Canada. He was married to a gal named Rosie Schuster. Her dad was Frank Schuster of Wayne and Schuster, who were the comedy giants of Canada. He'd come down to the States, written for Laugh, and Lorne had a real background, particularly as a comedy writer. And he loved the idea of live, and that was something that was key to me. And Schlosser had said he really would like the show to be done live in New York. And we assembled a cast of really talented crazies and went on the air October 11th of '75. And most people think it was a smash at the beginning. There was not a decent rating for that show until about 5 months in, when they repeated the Richard Pryor hosted Saturday Night Live, which had been about 4 or 5 months earlier. And that show got a huge rating, and the ratings just continued year after year after year. I left after the early years. Lorne was doing the show by himself. But at the end of 5 years, he'd had a falling out with the then management at NBC, a management that I hadn't been very crazy about either. And the show began to erode in the ratings. And they tried to get Lorne to come back, and he wouldn't come back to work for that guy. And I certainly didn't want to work for that guy, but I agreed to a meeting. Had the meeting and sort of established that if I could keep the show on the air for a period of time, they would start buying shows from my production company. And out of that came things like Friday Night Videos, and later with Bob Costas. And I had this great partnership with Vince McMahon called Saturday Night's Main Event. And other than the Tonight Show, that was the dominant thing in late night. Saturday Night Live got healed thanks largely to Eddie Murphy, who was 18 and sort of an extra when I got there. It was not a hard thing to figure out that he was the most talented person there. And Bob Tischler, who was another producer I brought with me, we just wrote, had people. We had Barry Blaustein and David Sheffield, who went on to write most of Eddie's movies. They were there at the time. And Eddie single-handedly saved Saturday Night Live, if the truth be told, that one season. And then the next year, we added Billy Crystal and Marty Short and all those other people. And Saturday Night Live was fine. By then, I was married to Susan. She had a hit comedy show in New York, Kate and Alley. We lived 100 miles from New York.
You met, she was guest host, right?
She came to host the second show that I did. And
because my agent told me that all the original people were back. So when the producer came to my hotel to say hello, I said, well, I'd done a movie with Jane Curtin. So I said, gee, you're not Lorne Michaels, are you? And he goes, no, I was the original person that hired Lorne Michaels. I thought, oh my God, what have I done? And we were married 6 weeks later, so that worked out great.
And that's now 38 years.
Yeah.
Oh, that's great. Now, you did some politically pointed sketch comedy, which was unusual, right?
From the beginning, yeah.
And
some
that
of the
was
most
around
fun.
an election year. What were your interactions with Gerald Ford, with Chevy Chase doing Gerald Ford?
Well, it was kind of bizarre because if you really know the facts, Ford was probably the greatest athlete to ever be president of the United States. But in his 1 year, full year of being president, he fell down a bunch of times. And so he got kind of this reputation as being a physical klutz. And this was all just as Saturday Night Live was getting started. And Chevy had this idea that he would fall down in every show, starting in the very first Saturday night. I thought it was a terrible idea. I just want to point out I had a lot of terrible ideas of my own. And Chevy, Lauren, and I forget who else was with us. We went down to the Village so that Chevy, and we could watch Billy Crystal. I think he was doing a routine at the time at some club. And when we came out, I was still not gung-ho, and we were only 10 days away from the first show about Chevy falling every week. When all of a sudden it's a driving rainstorm, he says, "I'll get a cab." And he starts running down, I think it was Lexington, which was coming, by the way, right at us. And there was a huge pothole, which I couldn't see. And Chevy had already scoped it out. And he did this whopper fall into this enormous puddle. And I turned to Lauren and said, if he's willing to do that, I guess I ought to give him a shot. And once again, he was right and I was wrong. And it worked for him. And he was quickly established at the beginning with that "I'm Chevy Chase and you're not." He became the first recognizable star to come out of Saturday Night Live.
And didn't you go to the White House at one point?
Oh, yeah. So Gerald Ford agreed to be involved. His press secretary was the one who signed on to host. And this was, the spring of the first full year. And we were invited, Lauren and I and Chevy, to go down, meet Ron Nesson, who was that press secretary. And the president was going to record, "I'm Gerald Ford and you're not, and I'm Chevy Chase and you're not," and a few other things. And we waited in the cabinet room, and the door opened, and in walked this really sweet, kind man who, as an aside, had gone to law school with my father. I'd never really known him that well, but that was the day that I met him. And he shot his piece, and we had an old-fashioned camera, and the mic was a film camera. The mic was attached to the camera. So when Ford was done, he said, "Thank you guys very much," walked away, pulling over the camera. There was quickly a meeting that we all agreed that we would never show that footage on the air because we were trying to help the president get away from the image of falling down all the time.
Oh, that is great. That's great. I want to remind people that you can ask questions by clicking participant at the bottom of your screen, and then click on your name, and you can raise your hand if you want to ask a question. And so I'm going to keep that open. I'm going to hop all over here for a second. We're in obviously an unprecedented time, such a bizarre dystopian reality right now.
That's a big word, Sam.
Yes, I looked it up. I think I
You
pronounced
know a lot of big words.
it. Yeah.
That wouldn't be
How
coming
did
out
you-
of Josh's mouth.
No Weisenhammer questions here. How did you, or where do you see sports going? In particular, the NFL, which is of my interest.
You mean in this pandemic time?
In the this fall, in the
I think it's all tied up. I think it's largely tied up in the American public becoming comfortable with some kind of vaccine. I mean, I've seen the same polling that probably everybody on this call has seen in the last 7 or 8 days. And overwhelmingly, 75% or more of the American people do not want to be in a stadium or an arena right now. They want sports to come back. I think they're willing to watch events where there are no people in the audience. But I don't see it coming back the way we know it until there's a real sense, again, by the American people that they're not walking into another pandemic by doing it.
Do you think the league can?
Someone said they might do a golf tournament, and that would be.
That's locked in with no crowd.
Oh, that would be something you could watch without a crowd, because we all watched the Tiger thing, the Masters the other day, and that if you had separate people talking with them like that.
Right, seems like you could do that, but the football, do you think they could pull that off? Football in an empty venue, and still create that energy?
It would be very different, but I mean, you'd still have America. I mean, the NFL is America's #1 sport, and they're desperate to have it come back. The NFL certainly wants it to come back. And if the short-term compromise is nobody in the stands, so be it. Let's have football, though.
Right, right. I've got a question here from Brian Marciano. I'm going to lower his hand and unmute him.
Can you hear
Go
me?
ahead, Brian.
Okay, I got it. Okay. Yeah, no, as always, just a thank you, Sam. This is the highlight of my day. I make sure I'm home at 4 o'clock.
Ah.
And Susan and Dick, thank you for joining us. I have a question for each. Susan, years ago, how did you get the Gene Washington jersey? Because at the time, the only people that would have it would be Gene and you, because they weren't sold. And then,
in fact, I had this idea to, be in a football jersey, and we loved San Francisco, and it was in San Francisco. And Gene Washington would not let us use his name. He said, "You can have my number, but you can't have my name." It was a real jersey, and it had his number, but not his name. And years and years and years later, because I married Dick and got around the whole sports industry, we met Gene Washington, and I said, "Your name would still be in reruns, and you would still be on television if you had let me put your name on that jersey." But it wasn't a trend then, so he wouldn't let us use his name. I don't know why. Maybe he wanted us to pay him for that.
Yeah, no, he probably regrets it now. And then
that
first cast on Saturday Night Live was legendary. I mean, did you know that was the right cast? And who was cut? Were there some people that auditioned that later became famous?
From the original Saturday Night Live?
Yeah.
Yeah, there were one or two who went on to greater glory, and it was really a tough time because, for example, the funniest person I thought, that doesn't mean everybody else felt that. I thought Belushi was just unbelievable. He was so physical and crazy. Chevy was pretty close to that. Gilda was a 1 in a million. But there were scary things. I mean, John. I mean, I was basically a network executive by then. That was my reward for helping to start Saturday Night Live. And he wasn't all that confident in the beginning that John was controllable. I mean, he worked it out. John was a huge part of the success of Saturday Night Live. He was, in the States, when you think about it, in the space of a year, he had the #1 TV show, or he was part of it. He had the #1 movie with, shot in Oregon.
Animal House.
Animal House. God, how stupid of me to forget that. And by then, the stuff that he and Danny used to do in warm up on the show, and I think they convinced, by then I was living in California, wasn't involved. But Lorne said, you guys can do that once or twice on Saturday Night Live. And the next thing you know, they probably had the #1 record in America. So they had the #1 late night show, the #1 movie, and the #1 album. I mean, it was unbelievable. So much of that was John's energy. Danny's never gotten enough credit for the thing that he did. There have been a lot of unselfish people in the history of Saturday Night Live who wrote for other people besides themselves, and these are stars. Danny was so generous. I mean, he wrote tons of stuff for John, but he also wrote stuff for many other people in the cast. And years later, those are the kind of things that the Billy Crystals did, and I'm sure there are plenty of people in Saturday Night Live today who are stars, but they still write for other people. It's a great act of generosity. You don't often see it in show business.
Okay, no, thank you for your time, and again, thank you, Sam. This is good.
You're mute, Sam.
Unmute. This is Les Bowen. I keep clicking the wrong thing. Les, can you hear me?
I can. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Good grief. Okay. Hey, thanks to everybody for doing this. I know you guys don't know me. I'm a sports writer, and so Sam knows. But I have a question for each of you, actually. Susan, like everybody else during this quarantine period, I'm watching a lot of TV these days, and I happen to be surfing around channels I don't normally find myself on. the other day, and I saw your MASH episode when you were the war correspondent who tempted BJ.
Almost all the way.
Yeah,
That was
almost-
really good, and you really portrayed a reporter very well. I was very happy to see that. I was going to ask you why you really stopped acting regularly not too long after that, like mid-'80s, right?
No, I stopped in the end of '89. Kate and Allie was done. We were done with the 5 years. And, you know, when a series would be done, because I had done 3, I would usually take a certain amount of time off, sometimes have a baby. And then then I'd start to get that feel like time to go back to work. But Dick took the job with NBC Sports almost concurrently with my stopping to do Kate and Allie. And so in the time that I would have been, and I also got pregnant with it and had another baby. And when it came time to sort of you know, like the agents would call and say, it's pilot season. Are you coming to California? I go, well, we're going to go to France and see the French Open and Wimbledon. Nah, this year's not good. You know? And so pretty soon I found out that my life, plus now I had 5 kids, was actually more fun than going to work all the time. And by the time I would have normally gone back, when my youngest was like, you know, 7 or 8 years old, or 5 or 6 years old, by that time I would be playing the mother of teenage girls. I already played the mother of teenage girls, and there wasn't a lot of stuff that was exciting to me to be out there. I would come back and do Murder, She Wrote. If one of my boys would develop that on a bicycle, solving crimes, I could definitely do that. Maybe in Hawaii, that would be really good. But yeah, I kind of lost the MASH is a fun story, because remember when they used to have movies for television all the time? They called them MOWs, movies of the week. So whenever you'd make a deal with a network to do something, they'd always tack on like 3 movies of the week that you do. I did a bunch of them. In fact, one of them, Brian Dennehy was in, and I'm so honored to have worked with Brian Dennehy. It was a terrible movie, but he was great. And
you had 3 husbands in that movie,
yes.
and he was by far the best.
Don't want to say the name of it or anything. There's something that you should go away. But I did a movie with Mike Farrell. And interestingly enough, I was listening to a podcast with Sue Grafton and what's his name that wrote, you know.
Grisham.
Yeah, with John Grisham. And she said, I wrote for television. I hated it. And I was sorting my scripts after that, and I saw that she had written the movie. She was by Sue Grafton, wrote the movie for television I did with Mike Farrell. And I said to him, if you guys are going to go off the air soon, would you tell them I want to do a MASH before you go off the air? He wrote it, and he directed it. So it was real first. He wrote the romance. He created that whole, you know, tension thing. And I was one of the very few people they let keep my uniform. I got to keep my, you know, like, oh yeah. Of course, I couldn't put it on my 2 arms now. I was so tiny. But I loved doing that. That was an awesome show. I could watch those. Can't you just watch those forever? They're great.
The old MASHs.
The MASHs, yeah.
Yeah, they are really good. I had a question for Dick also. It's probably an unanswerable question, but it isn't a sports question, actually. It's I know you were in charge of NBC News at one point.
That's stretching it. That's stretching it. I had a title of being Senior Vice President of NBC News, and it was a very, very interesting time. But I learned, I thought he asked the question. He was asking, did I remember being involved? I was. But you know what? I was also the head of sports at the same time.
Oh, okay.
I had responsibility for the Today Show. So I was going to work every day at 6 a.m. and leaving the building at about 10:30 or 11 o'clock at night. And that convinced me pretty quickly that I was an idiot, and the job on the news side faded away within about 6 months. I have great admiration for the people who do the news, particularly today, where they're so ready to jump at any story. That wasn't always the true years ago. I remember, though, during one of the weeks I was still there, NBC News got a tip. A producer did that there was something going on in Berlin and that the wall might fall. And I didn't go, but they got broke out in New York, and he got there in time to watch the wall go down. I remember being in the control room in New York. You never saw so many people with such pride that they had pulled that off. It was fun to observe. Yeah.
Wow.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Les. We will go to Phil Hirsch, legendary Olympics rider.
Hey, Phil.
Hey, Dick. I don't know if I've ever met Susan, but here we are. I'm very envious of you being probably in Wailea, it sounds like, right?
We are in Wailea, and if you can imagine this, the Grand Wailea is completely closed down. The Four Seasons is closed down. Every hotel here is completely closed down. The beach, you can go in the water, but you can't lie on the beach. If you do, they come and take you away. But we've got this great setup where we have 2 condos. One we're in right now and another one down below from friends. And the one down below allows us to go down there and run into the water and come back out and not worry about anybody telling us to cut it out. They've done a phenomenal job here, really phenomenal. They're now rated the 3rd best state in the union for having low numbers with the virus. And it's come from them basically policing themselves by taking down the industry that they survive by. I mean, 75 or 80% of all the money that comes through here is tourism dollars. And there are none. I mean, the average number of people coming in here on a plane right now, not counting the crew, is like 9 people.
Wow. Well, anyway, now let me ask the question.
Sure.
I was searching my my memory bank, and I don't think you were ever in a situation where you had to, in the old days prior to the Olympics being split apart, where you had to do 2 in 6 months. And now, if in fact there is a 2020/21 Olympics, NBC will be doing 2 in 6 months, both in Asia, as it turns out, relatively close. What would be the challenges of that? And of course, as it turns out, NBC has a new person in charge of the whole Olympic operation this year, so she's going to face some interesting challenges. What would be the challenges that you see of doing 2 so quickly now, when they're so much bigger than they were back prior to '94?
The Olympics are indeed much bigger than they were at any time that I was doing them, and I had quite a few that I was the lead producer on. Now with live and with streaming, live, no matter what time of day, I always was saving everything for prime time when you could get the biggest rating, and half the newspaper writers in America wanted to kill me. But the bottom line is, it's much more difficult today than when I was doing it. And Molly Solomon, who's the new head there, she's been named the head now at least 2 months. She came in 1989 as an Olympic researcher, which is the great entry-level job in all of television. I was lucky enough to be the first one, but all these other people like Jeff Zucker, who today runs CNN, another Olympic researcher, her training is unbelievable. And as a production eye, she's proven it again and again in the various events she's done during her career. She'll be a smash. The tough job, I think, looking ahead at the Olympics, Phil, is going to be for Mike Tirico, because not only is he going to host 2 Olympics that close together, but unless I'm wrong, in the midst of all that, between the 2, he's got a Super Bowl to do as well, I think. I could be off. Maybe he's.
Oh, you're correct. That's correct.
Yeah, so he'll be a busy guy. But I don't have any doubt that she'll handle that. But it's so big now. I remember sitting in a room in Athens years ago when it suddenly dawned on me we were having this long production meeting. It was a year before an Olympics. And just screwing around, NBC by then had 2 cable networks. And I figured out we could put almost everything on the air. And we got up to about, we thought we could do 1,000 hours. This is planning a year out. And I finally said, you know, the person who's going to end up doing most of this is probably Molly. So we called Molly. Molly was in a hospital in Connecticut having just delivered triplets. And she thought it was the coolest thing in the world that we had interrupted her having triplets. We didn't actually get to have the phone call while she was in the birthing room, but she was just as turned on by the fact that she was going to have a chance at the beginning of her career to do something like this as she was having these 3 delightful kids. So she's up for that role. She'll do a great job.
Thank you, Phil. I've got a line here. I'm going to go to Chris Stone, former Sports Illustrated editor, who is now our sports editor at the Los Angeles Times. Chris?
Dick, hi, Susan. Thanks for agreeing to this. Bill kind of took my question, so I'm going to improvise here a little bit.
Go ahead.
You know, I spent 27 years at Sports Illustrated before I got the call to the big leagues and the times higher. But I really felt, especially towards the end, a day couldn't go by where I didn't hear in some form or other that, Sports Illustrated, wasn't the same hallowed institution that it once was. And, looking at it from the other end for you, Dick, was Saturday Night Live, for example. I mean, granted, you've been away from it for about 40 years now. Is that correct?
From the start of it, but well, wait a minute. The last show that I produced would have been in 1985.
Okay, so
yeah, 40 years.
About 35 years.
40 years, yeah.
Saturday Night Live, just by virtue of having been around for 45 years and having commanded such a central place in kind of our cultural ether, when you look at it, what do you see? When you've been there at the beginning, it's probably, we're inclined to think, well, it's nowhere near as good as it was when I was there 35, 40 years ago. But when you look at it now, are you still surprised by it? Are you still delighted by it? Do you pay attention to it?
The only thing I do differently with Saturday Night Live today really is the fact that most of the time I watch it with Susan at 7 o'clock the next morning. I'm blown away. First of all, Lorne's energy is inexhaustible. I mean, when you consider that not only is he doing Saturday Night Live, but he's also doing the Tonight Show. He's also doing the show with used to be the newscaster on Saturday Night Live. Now does the show. Pardon me?
Barry, that one? The one Barry?
Seth Meyers.
Seth Meyers,
Seth
thank
Meyers.
you. Thank you, and excuse me, Seth Meyers, whoever you are. But I believe right now, Chris, the writing on the show is more consistently good than it has been in a very long time. And some friends of mine went back to the show when Eddie did it as guest writers. And they said that the way that Lorne has done this, particularly with Colin Jost and Michael Che, they're the head writers as well as the stars of Update. The writing is really well organized so that they have lots of good stuff to choose from. And I always felt Saturday Night Live, your biggest competition was, and I still believe today, is sleep. And so I would say from the very first time we did a show together, Lorne and I, and then when I did it by myself years later, and I think he does it still today, you basically put your very best stuff in the first half hour. You've got to hold on to the audience. But I find now, and I know there's some people who disagree with me, but I find now that the writing on that show consistently is strong well into the show. Yeah, there may be a couple of clunkers in the last 15 or 20 minutes, but I find most shows have much more than an hour of stuff that I enjoy. And I guess a lot of the credit goes to Che and Jost and to Lorne.
Can I slide in one more quick question?
Sure, go.
On behalf of Catherine, what's your greatest Saturday Night Live memory? Your favorite?
Well, the greatest Saturday Night Live memory I've ever had has been my partner for 38 years. And we have this large family together. We've had a joyous life, except for one really, really bad day. But none of that would have been possible if Susan wasn't in my life.
How about Larry the Lobster? That was one of the great Saturday Night Live. Or they did one that was the killing of somebody. Remember, they made him a star. It was Eddie did both parts, I think. He also played the assassin, right?
Yeah.
And they did it like
The assassination of Buckwheat.
Yeah. Oh, Buckwheat.
It's because Eddie came to me. I'll never forget this. Buckwheat had been a major character. He started actually the night Susan hosted, so it was show 2 of the 85, 86 season.
81.
Really?
Yeah. Yes,
Okay.
dear.
All right.
We were married in 82.
Okay. In any case, Eddie said, I can't do this anymore. So what are you talking about? He said, wherever I go, people are saying, do Buckwheat, do Buckwheat, do Buckwheat. And I said, well, what do you want to do? He said, I want to kill him. And most producers at that point, I think, would have gotten down on their knees. But this was this gloriously talented human being, which he still is today, in all his innocence, had a real valid reason he didn't want to do it. By the way, he had a long line of other characters. So I said, okay, but get Barry and David involved. They were the 2 top writers. And they did. and they set it up a car. In the old days, you could go into NBC. The main entrance into that building was by the ice skating rink. So live on a Saturday night, there were cops around so that nobody took this for real. As Buckwheat got out of his car to go up into the NBC studio building, he was taken out. And meanwhile, then the camera went immediately to Piscopo, who was in another studio looking as if he was Peter Jennings, covering the story. So now it's about a week later, I get this phone call, and God rest his soul, it's from the office of Grant Tinker, who was then running all of NBC. And he asked to see me. And I went up to his office. He said, you know, Dick, I know you're having a real problem with the censor. He's very upset, but he says that this assassination of Buckwheat thing is just, it's not a good idea, because on Sunday night, remember, we were talking about Saturday night. On Sunday night, we're presenting this movie, which, by the way, had been produced and won Don Ohlmeyer the Emmy for the special of the year. It was the one about the taking of a naval base in South Carolina using a stolen nuclear device. And the idea was that the Saturday Night Live script mirrored that pretty much. And the censor was desperately afraid. And I looked at Grant, who was a heck of a wonderful guy. I said, Grant, I can't believe this. We're not going to put on a sketch about the follow-up to Buckwheat's assassination, hosted by Joe Piscopo in pretty crappy makeup trying to play Peter Jennings. And we're not going to let that thing air. And he looked at me and he started to giggle. And the piece aired the next night. And to this day, I still think of it as one of my favorite moments of Saturday Night Live.
Oh, that's great.
Thanks to both of you.
Thanks, Chris. We'll go on to a guy, Fred Gadelli. I don't know if you know him. Fred.
What's up,
Fred
Sam?
Gadelli is the heart and soul of my baby.
Fred Gadelli, I've heard that name before.
Fred Gadelli is the reason that
Look at
still
Fred.
12 years
Look at
later.
Freddie.
Freddie, hey, Reese.
Look at Freddie with a beard.
Oh,
Do you have a
wait.
Do you have a ponytail yet, Fred?
No, I actually cut my own hair today.
Oh, it's getting
Fred
crazy.
Gadelli made Sunday Night Football, took Monday Night Football to Sunday night. And,
Well, hey, Sam, you know, Dick and I, we probably talk 15 times a week. So I don't want to really take anybody's opportunity here. I was just going to mention to Susan that the first football game ever produced, my analyst was Gene Washington.
Is that right?
Really?
Yeah, it was a Thursday night game at a place that doesn't have a football program anymore, Boston University.
Oh, wow.
They were hosting Maine. And,
the big game.
That was a biggie.
Yankee conference game. And yeah, Gene was my analyst, and he was my analyst for a couple of years. And at that time, I think he was Jim Hill's backup at KTLA in Los Angeles. Yeah, in Los Angeles. No, Channel 7 in Los Angeles, ABC in Los Angeles. And yeah, he was my first analyst. But Sam, Dick and I talk like twice a day.
Yeah, so you've got no more.
I figure.
You know, Sam, there's some days where Susan said, again? I mean, she thinks the two of us are like attached at the hip, and in many ways we are. Fred's the best friend that I've got in the world, I think, other than my wife.
I feel the same way.
See, I've trained.
So quit hogging the spotlight, Fred.
You know, I want to get a word into Michael there up in the corner on my third screen. We're back at it with Bosch, and you know, I was born in LA. I was raised in LA till I was 12, and then we moved to Illinois and on. But so all the places that, I mean, Dupar's, I drag Dick to Dupar's every time we're in LA because it's open 24 hours. So we feel like we're going home. LA is like another featured character in that show. It's so great. We love it. Just saying. I want you to know that.
But Maddie's mother didn't have to die there. That's in our head now whenever we pull out.
Michael,
yeah.
can you say something about that? Yeah.
Well, hey, by the way, because they're closed right now, Dupar's, you can go there and buy their pancake mix. They'll set you up.
Really?
All at home. But, thanks for watching the show. I was gonna go back to you guys, go back to Saturday Night Live. And Dick, you said that the show didn't take off for 5 months. And I was wondering what those 5 months were like. Were you like waiting for the dread call that you're getting canceled? I mean, I think they gave shows a better chance back then. Now, 5 months of not taking off and you're dead. So I'm just wondering what that was like every day, every Monday.
That's one of the greatest questions, and it has an equally great answer. The show did not get what would be considered a good rating until, as I said before, Richard Pryor's repeat aired about 6 months later. So the next question is, well, how did you survive those 6 months? Here's how. That fall, for the first time in history, NBC, which had never been number one, always number two, fell to third place. And one of the guys, now long deceased, who played a big role in me leaving sports at ABC to go to NBC and be in entertainment, he got really killed and ultimately canned for that primetime season falling apart. 2.5 months into that primetime season, Lily Tomlin hosted Saturday Night Live. And it was a triumph. I mean, she was fantastic. Lauren was in seventh heaven because the two of them were great friends. And they put on a hell of a show. And the TV critic then of the Times wrote a review Thanksgiving Sunday. We had no idea it was coming out. And the headline was, NBC has found its show of shows. And the review went on from there to give it a level of praise that we certainly never expected. But it played perfectly into the hands of those of us who were working on the show, because no one ever mentioned anything about doing away with the show after that. And it's rare in our business. Oh, and I forgot, the punchline to all this is, the guy's review began by saying he had missed the first show because he forgot it was on. He had missed the second show because his subway train got stopped on its way into Brooklyn. I mean, he printed all these excuses. He wrote that review, and by and large, he had never seen the show. I mean, but he wrote this rave, I think, based on what friends had told him and so forth. But that review, on top of what was going wrong in primetime at NBC, guaranteed that that show would be fine for quite some time. And by then, it hit its stride. I mean, the original cast was on fire. And the only other times that people have written that Saturday Night Live might go away, those people have long since passed on. It used to be a favorite headline of a lot of American newspapers, Saturday Night Dead versus Saturday Night Live. But I don't think anybody's seen that now in more than 20 years. And these last 18 years or whatever it's been that Lauren's been back, he's been phenomenal at coming up with great young talent time after time after time.
But do you remember how we used to hang on whether the Beatles would get back together to be on Saturday Night Live, because Lauren would offer them $10 or something. And I guess the story goes, right, that it almost happened, right? That John and Paul were sitting in the
John in the building
in Dakota.
In the Dakota, and Paul kept saying, "Let's go over there. Let's go over there." And they got to the door, so the story goes. And John said, "Nah, we really don't want to do that." But they ended up, particularly Paul, he's still very close to Lauren. Ringo hosted for me, and it was a delight, except when read-through, where they read all the scripts and then the producers decide what's going to be in the show, was awful. The scripts were terrible. And the only time in the years that I produced the show, and I bet you $1 Lauren never did this, I was so mad. It was to be the Christmas show. It was Ringo. And when read-through was over, I walked Ringo back to his hotel, which is a couple blocks away. And I said, "Don't worry, everything will be fine." And I went back, and it's the only time I said to the writing staff, "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to write to the lead characters of comedy on this show." So if I remember correctly, they wrote, Marty Short in those days had Ed Grimley. They wrote a Grimley piece with Marty and who are we talking about? Oh, Ringo.
Yeah.
You can see my memory starting to fade these days. But the bottom line was, it was the only time the writing staff was ever told by the producer, "You will write all these key characters in." And it turned out to be a great show, but I was mortified. The cast was tired, the 6 straight shows, 7 weeks or something like that. But, turned out great. You wouldn't have liked somebody telling you what to write.
Yeah. Thank you, Michael. This is a good friend from college, from Occidental College, where I went to school, Chris Bradley. Chris? Unmute. Wait, Chris?
There we go. Yeah, you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Thanks for having me. I'm just average Joe here and enjoying this. Real quick, I was probably one of the first subjects of Sam's writing. His first stint with the Times at the Glendale edition, and I really want to recount of the Pulitzer voting that year. I think we were robbed, Sam. But I'm a I was born in the mid '60s and grew up on TV and watched TV evolve, and I'm a great fan of both of you two. So this is really a joy for me. And you mentioned about live being a key aspect of SNL, but if you think about the early '70s, live coverage really came about with Watergate and then, of course, Munich. And I'd just like to hear about, your experience being there in Munich and what it was like, especially with the live coverage that was going on during that.
Well, you bring up two very interesting things. I remember on the night that all the resignations took place in Washington, or maybe they were the firings that Nixon did. It's called the Saturday Night Massacre. And just by happenstance, I was in Rune's apartment in New York, and we'd been watching something. It was a Saturday night. It was rare to be in New York. I think he was with his girl. I don't think I had one at the time. And all of a sudden, this story broke. And you've never seen a creative giant be as enraged as Rune was, because ABC News never went on the air that night. The people running it at the time didn't think it was worthy of a story. So you had CBS and NBC running with this story, doing a fabulous job, and ABC never went on. It was probably no more than 4 or 5 years later that Rune became the head of news as well as sports. And
What about Munich?
did a wonderful thing. Well, Munich's a whole different story.
Well, that's what he asked you about.
No, he asked me first about the Saturday night.
Oh, I
Yeah.
didn't know that.
No. So Munich, again, I happened to be up really late. It was 5 a.m. in Munich. We had gone off the air about an hour before. And I was Rune's assistant in those days, as well as an associate producer of the coverage. And it was the last Monday night of the game. Spitz had won his last gold medal. Everything was just so happy. And Rune said to me, we've got to draft this letter. There was a guy running the NCAA at the time named Walter Byers, who really was a miserable son of a bitch. And Rune didn't get along with him. And we had the exclusive rights to college football. They were about to be negotiated again. And Rune wanted to figure out how I could come up with drafting a letter that he could send to Walter that could heal some of the breaches, because we had to go meet with him 10 days later in Missouri. We came out of the building, I'll never forget, and we walked out by the side of a loading dock from the studio we had. And straight in front of us was the fence that went around the Athletes Village. And it was not electrified fence. There was only one car there. It was a Mercedes sedan. It was purring away. It was Rune's driver, who was going to take the two of us back to our hotel. And beautiful full moon. As I said, it's the middle of this wildly successful games. And Rune's just standing there, so taken with this moon, just waxing poetic about how everything had gone so beautifully, when the driver, who was really a character who had driven us all at various times in Europe, he was a driver for whatever Wide World of Sports group happened to be producing a show anywhere in Europe. He said, "Come on, Rune, the kid's tired, so am I. Get in the car. I'm taking you back to the hotel." We got in the back seat of the car. We drove about 150 yards, and we took a left. The rest of this is what the investigators in the German police told Rune about 9 months later, that the terrorists had all been in various containers in the dumpster. We probably came out of the building a good hour later than anybody had ever come out before. The car had been there all the time. They didn't want to give themselves away. This was their supposition in the investigation. We left. They went over the fence. They went down, I don't know, several hundred, more than seven, maybe 500 or 600 yards. And the building that you always remember from the footage, which is where the Israeli athletes were, the part that's not talked about a lot, was across the way. It was the building where most of the East German athletes were housed. And the Stasi, those were the East German police, as the facts came out in the years that followed. The weaponry that the terrorists used was all hidden there, and they came down that street unarmed, picked up all that stuff, and went in and started shooting up the place. It was really a tragedy, and yet again, it was a chance to watch Rune's genius in action, because we went back to our hotel, I left that step out, went to bed, and about an hour and a half later, Rune got the phone call. Nobody remembered to call me. I didn't get a phone call until about 3 hours later. But anyway, he just sat at that desk. McKay was out on the set. McKay wasn't the host of those Olympics. The host was a guy named Chris Schenkel, who had been like the voice of college football and stuff, but he'd never been a host of anything like the Olympics. And Jim sat in that seat for hours in the same wet bathing suit he'd been exercising in the pool at our hotel before he went back to work that day. Never. Wow. Anyway, Rune had them open. There were big doors to the studio. He had them open those doors and take 2 of the 4 cameras we had and roll them out right up to the fence. And most of the shots that people remember were never seen anywhere in the world other than in the United States, because these were American cameras. And we were lucky enough to have booked satellite time. That used to be when everybody fought over satellite time. There was usually only 1 or 2 up at any one time. Anyway, Rune won the Emmy that year for the best sports show, the Olympics, and for the news. And he got this letter from Walter Cronkite that he treasured more than I think almost any possession he had, that where Cronkite just said, you took all of our breath away. And Rune was a giant. I mean, he was an absolute giant, a production whiz, a real intellectual, a man who loved music. I mean, he had it all. And all of us who were lucky enough to be young and to learn at his side were blessed. Don Ohlmeyer is another one that comes to mind. We were so lucky to have him.
Thank you, Chris.
Thanks for that. Thanks for that perspective. That was riveting.
We'll go to Bob. Hey, hang on one second. I didn't mean to cut you off there, Chris. Looked like you wanted to say one thing here. Okay. You can unmute yourself if you like. Bob Hagan, my good friend from the Minnesota Vikings, is going to ask you a question. Now, Bob, unmute. I'm wearing,
all right. Hello.
Appropriately wearing your colors, Bob.
Nice. I have a couple props here. One signed by Dick Ebersol, compliments of Fred Godelli, and those are my props. But anyway, wow. My Fred Godelli is Fran Tarkenton, who I talk to almost every day. Talk to him, and he's doing something every day during this time. But he was the first ever athlete to host Saturday Night Live. And I just, and he talks about that quite a bit. And my question is, what was it like dealing with all the different athletes on Saturday Night Live?
You know, you're spoiled when you have people in your life like a John Madden, as Freddie and I have both had that rare opportunity. I mean,
he hosted
for me, and I actually got him to come up to the 17th floor. Most people don't believe that story, but he came up once on the freight elevator. But John, I think of John as being my idealized favorite college professor, my favorite uncle, the great father who lived next door. I think Freddie feels the same way. We still talk to John multiple times a week up in Pleasanton where he lives. I'm trying to think of I really did not have a problem, I don't think, ever with an athlete host. I had
Nick Nolte was in trouble.
Nick Nolte, but Nick Nolte turned out to be great. Nick Nolte announced after read-through, he left the building, he went to a bar, had a bunch of drinks, and called me and said, "I can't do this," and he left.
On Wednesday,
On,
right?
yeah, on Wednesday, and the show's Saturday, and read-through's over, and all the stuff, most stuff's been written for him. When I looked at Bob Tischler, who was my right arm on doing the show, and I said, "There's only one person who can host the show. It's Eddie." And Eddie at that point was 18 years old. And I remember calling all the cast back in and telling them that what had happened and that Eddie was going to host the show. And I'll never say who did what or whatever, but there were a few who frowned. And it was one of those times in my life where I just smartly kept my mouth shut because I really would have ripped him a new one. I mean, this was the most exciting comedic talent in America. And he was about to be put out there.
Well, they were promoting 48 Hours, right?
Yeah, but he
Nick.
wasn't going to lose anything.
Yeah.
But it was the
Yeah.
fact that there were so many small people in that cast. By the way, none of the stars. That's probably why they weren't stars. But that was terrifying. And then, of course, now my memory's coming back. The single most terrifying moment I ever had on Saturday Night Live was due to somebody from the world of sports. And that was when Madden hosted. During dress rehearsal, in the last half hour, and the musical guest that week was Jennifer, I think her name was Hudson, and she was the rage of Broadway. She had a Dreamgirls, and she was the musical host, I guess. John was the host, and this is about 3/4 of the way through the taping, and John's out on the floor and getting ready to introduce the musical guest. And basically, the only point of that rehearsal is so that the host knows where he's got to be to announce a musical guest with the guest over his shoulder or something like that. And all of a sudden, I'm standing kind of off to the side, and Madden says, "Dick, Ebersol?" And I looked up. He said, "This is it. I want you to know this is it. This is the single worst experience of my entire career in sports or in television, being associated with you this last week." And my heart just about sunk to the floor when he suddenly raised up his right arm and pointed at me and said, "Gotcha, didn't I?"
What about the guy that was from Monday Night Football? You know, that was famous for knowing Ali. You know,
Howard. Oh, the last thing Howard ever did was host Saturday Night Live. He actually hosted the last show I ever produced. And it was a delight. And Billy Crystal wrote this sketch where he played Howard's mother in drag. And it was Howard's bar mitzvah. And little Howard was played by Freddie Kohler, who was the little boy who was in Kate and Alley at the time with Susan. And I don't think I've ever seen a bizarre scene that when Howard leaned over to give his wife, being played by Billy in drag, a kiss. And Howard had swilled some vodka and still had part of a cigar in his mouth. And how Billy was able to finish this show because some of that got into his mouth and down his throat. And that's probably the lowest moment I can remember from a comedic standpoint I ever experienced on the show.
We are it's actually exceeding an hour, but I just have to ask. I so appreciate you spending this time with us. But Susan, I by every account, you're really the glue that held the family together after the 2004 plane crash that claimed your 14-year-old son, Teddy. And some of the most moving things I've ever seen are the Tim Russert interview, the Oprah Winfrey special on that. And I wonder, I know that you've been a beacon of hope for people who have endured that sort of unimaginable, unspeakable tragedy of losing a child. And I wonder how that's sort of shaped your outlook and how you've counseled people who have
You know, I remember before that happened saying to Dick, if I ever lost a child, I would never speak again. That would be it. I would just sit down and I would never speak. I think it was saw a movie with a little casket or something. But of course, the minute something like that happens, I had 4 more kids. You know, I mean, of course you're going to speak again. And the interesting thing about grief and how, and everybody's different. You know, some people don't want to talk about it. We were blessed in a way because Dick was injured in a way that he couldn't leave the bed. He was in a clamshell thing for 6 weeks. He couldn't leave the bed. It wasn't like he couldn't, you know, they recommended it. He couldn't go back to work. And I think a lot of times, especially anybody with an exciting and fun big career, thinks, I got to go back to work because that's how I'll get through this, go back to work. And yet I think what really saved us was that all my kids, the 4 kids that were left, all were at a point in their life. One was teaching school, he got a sub. Charlie was at Notre Dame and they gave him permission to be out. Willie was at SC. My daughter was between jobs. So the whole entire family was together for the whole 6 weeks before Dick went back, and he was better and he went back. So nobody got away from each other, you know, because I think especially in couples and families where, you know, one kid is exalted in their death, or, you know, the dad goes back to work and the mother's kind of left there. I think that really did more for us than anything else, was that we all got to be together for that awful first 6 weeks. And that's the hardest. And I remember when Dick went back to work, because any of you that knew Dick as a working man, he was rather, you know, strident in a way. You know, I mean, he was very accessible and he walked the halls and talked to everybody and everything else, but he was also very, you know, final in his decisions. And I think in retrospect, talking to Amy and some of the people who worked really close with Dick, they were like, what's this going to be like? He comes back into the office and what are we going to do? And Dick came in and he went over to people. And I think he surprised everybody. We just hug them and, you know, say thanks for your letter and went around and all that. So I think that so much of the appropriate behavior that we got was from all of us being able to live through those first 6 weeks without any interruption at all. You know, read the letters, do the things that you need to do, because otherwise you're putting it off. You know, when people go back to work too soon, or a lot of people throw themselves into a, you know, foundation that's really popular, you know, 2 weeks after they've got a foundation going. And I always think, you know, it's going to catch up with you. Those first 6 weeks that we had were the core of it, you know, and we were able to do that together. And I think that was huge. And, you know, Michael Phelps was the first person at the church. And, you know, if you put this in time, this was in 90, so he had done what? He hadn't done, wait, it was 2004.
2004.
So it's before China?
He won 7 gold medals
in Athens. So Dick knew him really well. He was a great kid and he loved Dick. But he and his mom were the first people at the church. I'll never forget. Somebody that was there said, you know, the first 2 people waiting at the church to come in. And that was the kind of outreach that Dick had with his athletes. I'm not sure that exists today in the same way it did when Dick was running NBC. Shaun White, you know, you look at any one of these athletes and they just were cultivated, you know, in their victories and in their defeats by Dick. And then they stayed loyal to the sport and the development of their sport and everything else like that. And Michael was kind of a shining example of that he showed up for us like that. So. Oh. And then the rest is just getting on with it.
Yeah. Well, I really appreciate your candor, and we had some great laughs. This was a really fun. I'm going to unmute everyone, and I will. Are they muted or unmuted? You guys muted?
We're unmuted now.
Okay, I'll applaud you.
Yeah.
Terrific.
Thank you.
Terrific.
Thank you, Sam.
Thank you for that.
Thanks, Sam. Great job.
Thank you so much.
It's fabulous. Thank you, guys.
Thank you very much.
I heartily recommend that you resume your day by watching Bosch.
Yeah. That's what we're going to be doing.
Immediately.
Thank you, guys. Great to see you.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot.
Hey, boys. Nice to see you, boys.
Likewise.
We'll see all of you. Next Tuesday is Rick Riley.
Dad, while we have you, I just wanted we're seeking comment from you on
Darren Ravel is reporting that a porn site is going to be paying Joe Buck $1 million to announce its porn cam shows live. Just wanted to know what your feelings on that were for Sam's article.
So Sam, you'll be covering that, right?
Yes, I guess that would be for hardcore sports fans.
Yeah.
It does give new meaning to the term golden goal.
Hey, Chris Stone, I think that's worthy of a charter to get Sam there quickly.
Oh, I'd insert a joke about beat writer, but I'm not going to.
Yeah, I think he's already turned that down on Twitter, but he turned it down with a real witty comment, and I can't remember the comment right now. I'm sorry. I could probably find that on Twitter, but
It's doubly funny too, because his joke on Brockmire this season is that his next book is called Joe Buck Yourself.
For those of you that haven't seen Brockmire.
oh, that's
It's funny.
the first episode of that. The very first episode is one of the funniest things I've ever seen in my life, where he has the meltdown as the announcer. Oh my God.
I know. And it just is, it's so blue that you can't recommend it to a lot of people.
Yeah,
but
no.
when you know who you're talking to, it's pretty darn
We just
funny.
kept looking at each other going, did they really say that?
And I'll never look at Hank Azaria the same as long as I live, because
Yeah.
he is Brockmire. I mean,
Yes.
come on. And how about Joe Buck being in so many of them?
But he also got the great Bob Costas episode where he tells Bob Costas that he's responsible for his pink eye at the Olympics.
That's right.
This feels like the SNL after party. I kind of like this. This is I like
Yeah,
that everybody unmuted.
All the way downtown in limousines and freeze our asses off to have a bad meal at 3:30 in the morning.
You guys
Where-
are awesome.
Chris Collinsworth on here. Was Chris on here for a while?
Yeah, but he took the Joe Buck money, so he had to jump off.
Well, thanks to everybody again. Take care.
Thanks,
guys.
Sam. Thank you. I'm so
Yeah.
flattered. Thank you.
That was awesome.
Thank you.
Aloha.
See you
Bye-bye.
guys. Thank you, Sam. Thank you for including us. This was awesome.
No, thanks guys for coming on.
We loved it.
Yeah.